There's nothing like the thrill of a comeback in Pokemon TCG, and I've experienced plenty ever since I've started playing, but the comeback, the upset, the absolutely unexpected outcome that today's deck in my 825 deck challenge provided was crazy. You will not want to look away from my final match of the day. This is the 825 deck challenge. The origin of all decks I'm creating on this channel, this now 821 slot wheel, with each slot representing a different Pokemon in rotation. Let's spin the wheel to see who the main character is today. This challenge definitely has me leaning into the water Pokemon, which I'll be honest has actually been kind of refreshing as each card brings a wave of something new. Wave. Like waves in the ocean. Get it? I'm so sorry. I promise Krabby the meta champion is not back. Finneon, as a basic water card, does exactly what I expected. Not much. With the singular water energy attack that does 20 damage, I was curious what its evo Lumineon did, as I assumed that's where any potential value would come in. And for one colorless energy, Lumineon's return does 20 damage and draws your hand up to 6 cards. Actually not too bad of a card to have, especially in the early game. But with Lumineon's attack being colorless, I thought for a moment in which direction I wanted to go, as the world was my oyster. And because I had so many options, the deck building process here actually took me a really long time until I finally settled on this deck. We got Finneon and Lumineon. Then we got the Quaquaval line. The Quaquaval EX has 2 moves. The first one is Spiral Shot, which does 230 damage and puts 2 energy attached to the Pokemon back into my hand. Then the other move is Exciting Dance, that does 60 damage, and then allows you to switch Quaquaval out for the active Pokemon on the bench. That means the Pokemon I'm swapping in would have to be an impenetrable wall, perhaps one that's hardened and protected. I was running Chewtle and Drednaw. Drednaw's attack, Hard Crunch, does 160 damage if the defending Pokemon has damage on it. And while this was great damage, his ability is what I had the turtle here for. If an incoming attack does more than 200 damage, then it doesn't actually do any damage to Drednaw. A super specific ability I was excited to give a go here, as if his attack could combo with Quaquaval EX, I'd be getting some solid damage out. To place energy, I also had a trick up my sleeve. A regular Quaquaval with the ability Energy Carnival, which lets me attach an additional energy from my hand each turn for free. For trainers, I really went with a large variety. I had Artazon, Buddy-Buddy Poffin, Ultra Ball, and Brock Scouting, all to get out the necessary Pokemon. Since I rely heavily on evolution Pokemon, the deck would fall flat if I didn't get out the Pokemon I needed in time. I included some Gust Up in the form of Boss's Orders and my A-Spec Prime Catcher. Then, as I have no natural hand draw in my Pokemon's abilities, I included Iono in Professor's Research. Additionally, if you can think of a tool, it's probably in this deck. Not really, but I had a large variety of tools, and I had some Arvens to help pull them when I needed them. I had Rescue Board, Powerglass, Counter Gain, TM Evolution, Luxury Cape. It was all here, and in the right circumstances could absolutely win me matches. I included primarily water energy, but also some spiky energy, as a lot of moves I'd be using would be requiring colorless energy, so why not do a little bit of extra damage if I'm getting hit? Giving Quaquaval some love and fully utilizing Lumineon, I was amped to see how this deck was about to unfold. Little did I know, I'd have some tough games ahead of me, and I was unsure if the deck would be a Veluza loser or meta champion. My first match was the longest match of Pokemon TCG Live that I've ever played. On my first turn, I was able to Buddy-Buddy Poffin for 2 Quaxlys and get things moving, even doing 20 damage with my Finneon with the thought that any damage I get out here will potentially help my Drednaw in an attack later. The other thing on my mind was the Swinub trio across from me. I assumed I'd be seeing Mamoswine EX soon, who does 180 damage plus an additional 40 for every Stage 2 Pokemon on their bench, which for me meant Drednaw was going to be very important, because with just one additional Stage 2 Pokemon on the bench, the Mamoswines wouldn't be able to touch him. With the Grand Tree coming down, Mamoswine came out, knocked out my Finneon before it could even become a Lumineon, and with a Quaxwell in my hand, I opted to evolve up the Chewtle using the Grand Tree. The game that transpired from here was absolute insanity. as my opponent also had a Quaquaval line set up on their back line, but not for Quaquaval EX, but for each of the Quaquaval abilities, one that helps with hand draw, and another, the one I'm running, that helps with energy attachment. With a Quaquaval EX set up and a Drednaw on my bench, it was time for my plan to come into play. I did 60 damage onto Mamoswine with my Quaquaval EX and swapped my Drednaw into active, and another Mamoswine came in. For the next few turns, Mamoswine didn't even bother to attack, as the hit wouldn't go and instead focused on charging up one of the Quaquavals on the bench, as the Quaquaval does a perfect 140 damage and when charged up would be able to take down my Drednaw, moving the game forward. I was trying to think about endgame here, and well, I didn't see a path to victory that included knockouts, but looking at how many cards were in our decks, I thought maybe there was a path to victory through getting my opponent's hand down to 0. Using Boss's Order and Prime Catcher, I'd strategically shift around my opponent's Pokemon in active to the point of no retreat for them, and the plan ended up working. Until it didn't, because their hand got smaller and smaller, and they also had some Boss's Orders, getting some additional knockouts here and there, and then it came down to just one prize card left on their side, but one of their Quaquavals was absolutely stuck in active. And with only one card in their hand, I really thought it was over. I thought I had done it. But they pulled out the Super Rod, adding cards back into their deck. I still had more cards in my deck though, so the turns of just drawing went back and forth again. And then, their Iono came out, and this was damning. As they had taken 5 prize cards, they only drew 1 card in their hand, while I had to draw 6, leaving my deck now smaller than my opponent's. My opponent's turns had been taking a while though, and so if I wasn't about to win by deck drawing, I'd hope maybe my opponent would lose the timer hitting 0. We took turns drawing back and forth, and I watched and prayed on every second that went by. It literally came down to the final 10 seconds. But unfortunately, with no cards in my hand, the game was over. Far from a thrilling match, but for sure one of my most notable to date because of just how weird it was, all thanks to the dynamics of Drednaw and Mamoswine EX. My following matches followed the formula I had more so been expecting with this deck, and after getting Itchy Pollen by Badoo, I was still able to get Lumineon up, getting a Quaxly looking good on the bench and using Return to do 20 damage to the Badoo and get my hand draw up. I saw the Dragapult taking form on the other side and was unsure if I'd have much to answer that, so I kept ahead, as did they, in getting our benches set up, with Lumineon getting a KO on Badoo.
Kaboom!
Lumineon out here taking KOs, check that out, good for Lumineon, right? Dragapult came up, took out my Lumineon, and I responded with my Drednaw. With Phantom Dive hitting for 200, I felt safe. And then he went in for the Jet Headbutt for 70. Unlike Mamoswine, Dragapult has a secondary attack, which takes out Drednaw in 2 turns. Oof. This was an inevitable loss. My next matchup worked similarly, where I just couldn't really get my game plan going. It was an Iron Valiant Gardevoir deck, which I had never really seen, and it was just an Agent of Chaos. The Iron Valiants, every time they switch into active, can put 20 damage onto one of my Pokemon, and just look at this chaos. So while I could get pieces set up, where my deck was really hurting was consistent energy and damage, and then just having to hope and pray that Drednaw would hold strong long enough for me to draw into energy. But with these Gardevoir robots coming at me, I just couldn't make it happen. This was a deck that I felt worked, but in the current state of the game and meta, likely didn't really stand a chance. With 3 losses in a row, I still didn't feel the deck was a clunker, just not as strong as what most folks should probably be running if they actually want to win. But that's what makes this a challenge, right? Building a deck from scratch and trying to claw my way to victory. I did a couple of last minute deck maneuvers, switching up my energies from the spiky to add in a couple of different basic energies, so I could also include Crispin to help with energy attach, as well as a Fezandipiti to try to increase some hand draw if I'm getting knocked out. I headed off to the final matchup to determine the deck status, but assumed it just didn't have the juice necessary to eke out the win. Alright folks, here we are, the final matchup to determine if my deck was gonna be a Veluza loser or a meta champion. Charmander started an active on the other side with a Munkidori on the bench, and I had Quaxly, and thanks to my Buddy-Buddy Poffin, Finneon and another Quaxly were getting in on the action. My opponent Grasping Drawed on their turn, which gave me further opportunity, so I Ultra Balled for the Lumineon, my Grasping Draw equivalent, and then Iono'd, which is when I had a tricky predicament. I was blessed with a Quaxwell to evolve up one of my Quaxlys, and I also got a TM Evo. I debated, do I use the TM Evo or return to get a little damage out and draw cards? But with 6 cards in my hand already, the TM Evo seemed like the better choice. Though unfortunately my Quaxwell was prized, meaning only one of my benched Pokemon even benefited from the TM Evo, though Quaquaval EX was out and I was ready to go. As I anticipated, my opponent got Charizard EX into play, and Charizard completely charred Lumineon. Back to me, I had Crispin in hand and wanted to return the attack on Charizard, but Crispin had other plans. Even though I had just added 3 different basic energy cards into the deck on top of the water energy, none of those energies seemed to be in my deck at the time, meaning I couldn't benefit from the double attach with Crispin and just had to attach a single electric energy for turn, and then let Powerglass that was attached to Quaquaval EX retrieve the water energy. I could have placed water down and done 60 damage and played the swapping game. However, my opponent had multiple 0 retreat cost Pokemon on the bench, and they also had Monkey Dory with Dark Energy ready to send the damage back my way, so attacking with only 60 damage here wasn't gonna work. My opponent next got Pidgeot EX in play and evolved up the bench Charmander into Charmeleon, before doing some massive damage to my Quaquaval EX. I'm always thinking about win conditions, and this was such an interesting spot to be in. Unlike Dragapult EX, Charizard EX can only do one attack, Burning Darkness, which does 180 damage plus 30 for every prize card that I have taken. If I could just get one Pokemon on my opponent's side knocked out, I'd get Charizard hitting for 210, potentially leaving my Drednaw to just clean things up, since Charizard wouldn't be able to touch Drednaw. But I needed to get a knockout, and it was also dependent on how much energy my opponent was running. Monkey Dory with a Luminous, or the Chi-Yu sitting on their bench, or even the Pidgeot EX could all damage the Drednaw under 200 damage threshold. I used my turn to Iono, and then opted to do the full 230 attack to the active Charizard, as I had no way to get any of the bench Pokemon in my grasp. My opponent must have been feeling great about the board state. They had Adrena-brained 30 damage on over to my benched Quaxly, Charmeleon in the backline evolved up into a Charizard after an Iono, and the Chi-Yu got 2 energy placed on it, which would be an absolute menace to my incoming Drednaw, as Chi-Yu's 2 energy attack does a base 50 damage, but an additional 90 if they had Pokemon KO'd in the previous turn. This would be the perfect return attacker if my Drednaw came out and knocked out Charizard EX. But let's rewind a moment, because when my opponent Iono'd, I drew the perfect hand. A Drednaw, a Counter Gain, a Water Energy, and a Boss's Order. So yes, my Quaquaval was now taken out by the active Charizard, putting me down 3 prizes, but the whole tides of the game were about to shift. On my turn, all of those pieces fell into place, but I couldn't have done it without the help of Calamitous Mountain, a stadium I have in my deck that puts 20 damage onto non-water basic Pokemon when energy is placed on them. Because of this damage, my Drednaw, who can now attack thanks to the Counter Gain and the Water Energy, was able to hit for the full 160, knocking out Chi-Yu, letting me take a prize card and leaving my opponent with 2 Pokemon charged up with Fire Energy that couldn't touch my Drednaw because they could only hit for 210. Back to my opponent, they Monkey Dory'd 30 more energy onto my bench Quaxly, leaving me with just 2 Drednaws. But that's all I felt I needed, and my opponent saw the impossible hill they had to climb. For 2 energy, the Pidgeot EX would be able to do 120 damage, but that would take a couple turns, and I had doubts that my opponent even had the necessary energy in play at this point. They Ultra Balled here, likely checking to see what cards they still had in their 17 card deck. And well, they were likely not impressed with what they saw. With the active Charizard 1 hit away from my Drednaw and unable to touch either of my Drednaws, my opponent did the unbelievable and scooped. I had believed in this deck, but also tried to be realistic that this deck likely wouldn't get me across the finish line, and after 3 losses in casual, I assumed it was going to be a Veluza loser. But it got a win where it mattered most, here in the final match, making this deck a meta champion. Congrats to you, Finneon, and on top of that, it puts me in the positive with 3 meta champion decks and 2 Veluza loser decks. If you want to take the deck for a spin yourself, check out the deck list below, and no, a win with it is not going to be easy, but if you get one, you're going to feel on top of the world. Thank you so much for tuning in to the 825 deck challenge, and I'll see you for another exciting wheel spin, and hopefully not another water deck, sorry Krabby, next time.